cyberwear, ocular optic upgrades, or fortified ankles allowing you to jump higher. These cybernetic implants from Cyberpunk 2077 all sound like something from a far-flung, and in this case, dystopian future. But we're not as far away as you might think. Human implants have been consistently improving over time, and some even use cybernetic components. Cyberpunk 2077 is a future that we could be approaching. This is the real history of Cyberpunk 2077. First, to make a distinction clear, cyborgs are essentially enhanced humans. If you attach an artificial component to yourself that will give you restored functions or enhanced abilities, that would make you a cyborg. As far as mundane things go, this is actually something we've been doing, in a way, for a long time. Take a look at human teeth. One of our shortcomings as a species has long been the degradation of our teeth. It's why advancements in dentistry and teeth cleaning have become so important. But with loss of teeth comes some of our first implants. All the way back to ancient China, over 4,000 years ago, remains of carved bamboo pegs have been discovered that were utilized to replace missing teeth. In fact, around the world, other implants have been found. Eventually in the 1950s, we'd discover titanium. Through experiments with rabbits, we learned that titanium can fuse with the human bone. Thus, modern implants typically use materials like titanium drilled into the jaw or skull bone. Okay, I know dentistry isn't the most fascinating thing, unless you're studying that, but if you want to turn yourself into a chromed out monster, a la older David from Edgerunners,
she's still going.
Well, let's start piecing it together. In Cyberpunk, you can replace your legs with fortified ankles to reduce fall damage and jump extra high, reinforced tendons to double jump, or even Lynx Paws to sneak around. Meanwhile, replace your arms with gorilla arms to pummel enemies, or Mantis Blades to shred them apart. This idea of replacing our limbs isn't anything new, and out of practicality is an old practice.
First I'll need me treasure hunting leg.
So old, in fact, that the first prosthetics we know of originate in Iran around 3000 BC in the form of an eye prosthetic. A big toe prosthetic was found on a mummy from around 950 to 710 BC, and in 2011, bioengineers were able to prove this worked and could be used to walk both barefoot or in sandals. By the 16th century, wood was still being used for prosthetics, but so too were other materials. Guts von Berlichingen, an imperial knight known as Guts of the Iron Hand, had, you guessed it, gorilla arms from Cyberpunk. Okay, fine. After losing his arm from a cannon causing his sword to strike himself, he had a prosthetic iron hand made to replace it, aka Guts became Guts from Berserk. Which, by the way, according to Kentaro Miura, creator of Berserk, was a total coincidence, in case you were wondering, because I was. Prosthetic technology would slowly advance through the early 1900s. But then, in 1958, an advancement would come through the USSR in the form of myoelectrics. And this is when things start to get a little more cyborg. Anytime a muscle contracts, electric signals are sent out. This includes things like extending an elbow, or even opening and closing your fingers. So, once the signal crosses a certain threshold, the prosthetic utilizes electrodes to read this and respond accordingly. On the downside though, due to the whole threshold thing, that does mean that there's a lag. Additionally, it's worth noting that while the limb moves, users don't get the same physical feedback as other prosthetics, making it difficult to use. In 1993, Chas A. Blatchford and Sons of Great Britain released the Intelligent Prosthesis. These prosthetics utilize microprocessors and eventually hydraulics and pneumatic controls. These microprocessors interpret signals and use these to control the knee joint. And then, in the 2010s, we get to robotic limbs. In 2013, at a hospital in Sweden, Max Catalin and Richard Brainemark of Chalmers University were able to, for the first time ever, permanently attach a prosthetic arm to the human body as a method called osseointegration. In fact, it used a titanium screw, similar to those teeth implants. This implant also utilized electrodes to read electric signals, like those myoelectric implants. Meanwhile, at MIT, Hugh Herr and his team had realized a fundamental issue with implants in prosthetics, in that while we've addressed how to use computers to move the prosthetic, the human receives no visceral input, meaning the person gets no true feedback themselves. Our body uses proprioception in order to sense our movements and location without needing to think, Proprioception being the contraction and stretching of different muscles with each action, and the signals of these being sent back to the brain. So, the scientists at MIT invented AMI, or the agonist-antagonist myoneural interface. This new surgical amputation procedure would allow scientists to create a contracting and stretching sensation that would feed back to the brain, creating a feedback loop between the brain and prosthetic. Hugh and his team were able to successfully perform the surgery and utilize the new prosthetic on Jim Ewing, a climbing friend who needed it, with the result exceeding their expectations.
My daughter came downstairs and asked me how it felt to be a cyborg. It wasn't that I was attached to the robot so much as the robot was attached to me. And the robot became part of me. It became my leg pretty quickly.
It worked so well, Jim Ewing was even able to return to climbing. So, with all of that in mind, we are well on the way to robotic prosthetics that can behave like human ones and have crossed the point of real-life cyborgs. But what about human augmentation, which is I'm sure what most of us think of when it comes to cyborgs? And when will I stop being lame Dave of YouTube and instead David of Edgerunners? Well, 3D printing has started to become viable for prosthetics. And there was a medieval man archaeologist found who replaced his amputated hand with a knife. So you do the math. Some of the upgrades you can unlock in Cyberpunk include bionic joints or lungs, with the lungs increasing your stamina, micro rotors which increase your attack speed, or titanium bones that increase your carrying capacity. Interesting choice on titanium, as we now know that titanium can fuse with bones, but I digress. Beyond the internal aspect of these upgrades in Cyberpunk, a working exoskeleton would really be able to achieve some of these very same tasks. The first idea of an exoskeleton traces all the way back to 1890 via Russian engineer Nicholas Yagin, whose exoskeleton was meant to assist in movement utilizing compressed gas. But it never came to fruition. Something that did come into fruition was 1960's Hardyman. Built by General Electronic, this was a powered exosuit built for the user to lift heavy objects. That said, it was heavy, had issues with power supply, and more importantly, bugs caused violent and uncontrollable motion by the machine. So in other words, Cyberpunk 2077 1.0.
Wow!
In fact, outside of rehabilitation exosuits, there have been a whole lot of pitches and ideas that just haven't really worked out. For example, there was the Tactical Assault Light Operator Suit, or Talos full-body exoskeleton proposed for the military in 2013 and deemed not feasible by 2019. More recently, in 2019, University of Central Florida's Gavin Barnes has been leading the engineering on the Onyx exoskeleton. It claims to only weigh 20 pounds and already allow users to do far more squats than normally possible without it on. That said, it's unclear what the power or battery requirements are. There are other suits out there being worked on for industrial use or rehabilitation, but the technology is still a ways away from Cyberpunk levels. Cyberpunk 2077 allows you to replace your eyeballs with ones that enhance your vision. Okay, yeah, we are nowhere near this one, but let's talk about where we are at. While we are nowhere near replacing a whole eyeball, we actually are able to transplant the cornea and have been for a while. The first cornea transplant was performed in 1905 by Edward Zerm of the Czech Republic, and by 2021, the success rate of these implants has now reached 41%. Still odds I wouldn't just willingly go to Ripperdoc for, but you know, it beats going blind. And one of the odder things I've seen while doing research for this, there's Neil Harbison.
Since the age of 21, instead of seeing color, I can hear color.
Neil Harbison is colorblind and sees the world in grayscale. In order to somewhat remedy this, he decided to attach an antenna and sensor to his skull in 2004, allowing him to hear sound via vibrations, and then had it drilled into his skull in 2013.
This is the sound of purple. For example, this is the sound of grass.
Meanwhile, since at least 2021, Dr. Kia Washington of University of Colorado's Anschutz Medical Campus has been trying to research ways to transplant an entire eye and was given $6 million in funding from the Department of Defense to research this. In 2016, she said she hoped it would be around 10 to 20 years away, but as of today, they still aren't in clinical trials. Next up, the brain. Cyberpunk 2077 allows you to upgrade your frontal cortex with things like RAM upgrades, increasing your RAM recovery rate, a memory boost, which recovers your RAM for defeating enemies, or a limbic system enhancement, increasing your chance of getting a critical hit. You can really think of these as neuro enhancements. In other words, pills. But really, not only do drugs come with side effects, this also isn't implantation. It does at least show that we have some understanding of how to affect various parts of our brain. Something that may help unlock a deeper understanding about our brains are quantum computers. These computers are the next evolution beyond digital computers, and according to scientist and expert Michio Kaku, have the ability to be infinitely more powerful. So how does all of this relate to cyberpunk and the brain? Today, we've been able to fully map out a mosquito's brain, which has 100,000 neurons. However, a human has 100 billion neurons in the brain, and beyond that, the number of connections those neurons can make is astronomical. And that is where quantum computers come into place. In theory, while it would take billions of years for a digital computer, a quantum computer should be able to map the human brain. And from there, could digital brain software be a possibility? I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see. In 2016, Elon Musk founded Neuralink, a company focused on creating microchip implants for the brain. The idea is that someone who's paralyzed would be able to use these chips to remotely control external technology, like cell phones or computers. Despite reports of internal conflict and issues within the company, in 2021, Neuralink was able to show a monkey playing games using one of their implants to receive banana smoothies. In May of 2023, Neuralink received FDA approval for human clinical trials and have announced recruitment for their first in-human clinical trial. Moving to the circulatory system, Cyberpunk lets you equip a biomonitor that instantly restores health after your health drops a certain percent, a blood pump that lets you restore health, or a second heart. And in some ways, we've already reached some of these. Granted, they don't enhance us, but keep us functioning as we already are. Back in 1889, John Alexander McWilliam experimented with adding an electrical impulse to the human heart. In Australia in 1926, a portable version of this device was thought of, and in 1928, it was used to revive a stillborn child. Interestingly, at the time, some looked down on this as reviving the dead, but by 1958, an external, wearable version of this device was made, the pacemaker. These devices can now be implanted in humans and cause an electric pulse in the heart, helping its wearers to regulate their heart rate. So in this regard, we already have cyborgs walking amongst us. We've also made major leaps just recently in organ transplants. In January 2022, David Bennett received the first xenotransplant, a genetically modified pig heart. While the transplant was successful, the heart eventually failed. In 2023, surgeons were able to successfully transplant a genetically modified pig kidney into a brain-dead patient that worked normally for over a month and are tracking its second month. These strides in genetically modified xenotransplants mark a new future for our understanding of what our bodies reject and don't reject. It's an exciting time for someone who might need a new organ, and again, who knows what lies in the future with this new understanding. Working our way into the immune system, some cyberware include a pain editor that reduces incoming damage, or a detoxifier granting immunity to poison. One thing we can relate this to in real life are nanorobotics. Nanorobots are extremely tiny robots we would inject into the human body in order to help fight diseases. In particular right now, they're viewed as a potential way to fight tumors and cancer. However, the field has fought multiple hurdles, both in getting these nanorobots to move within the body, as powering something that small is a challenge, as well as the fact that our body's natural immune system would fight them off. Thus, non-bio nanorobots would be coated in a special substance so they wouldn't be detected. For cancer, this would mean that you could target specifically the cancer cells and deliver chemotherapy only to them. Nanorobots were successfully used in 2018 to target and shrink tumors in mice and Bama miniature pigs. But at the moment, this particular treatment only works for very specific cancer conditions. nanorobotics are still in very early phases and not yet ready for human use, but it does showcase that we're getting closer to utilizing robotics as a means of bolstering our immune system. From neofiber to nanorelays, you can also operate on the human nervous system in Cyberpunk. And in real life, it seems the answer to this is typically to restore lost function in people with spinal cord injuries via neuroprosthesis. The history of this includes a cochlear implant created in 1957, which is a neuroprosthetic that would aid in hearing loss. In 1988, FES, or functional electrical stimulation, was developed to help treat paralysis from injury to the central nervous system. It uses electric pulses to generate body movements and help retrain motor functions. Today, these neural implants communicate wirelessly with a prosthetic counterpart. While this is most commonly used for hearing loss, researchers are working on restoring motor function with these neuroprosthetics. Anything related to the integumentary system in Cyberpunk is going to mean some type of subdermal armor. With the prosthetic, I guess we could eventually do whatever we want, but taking that out of the equation. In a way, plastic surgeries are modern subdermal implants. Not that rhinoplasty or breast implants are going to help you when Maelstrom decides to shoot you up, but it does show we can put things under the skin. As of 1994, certain body artists have gone forward with using subdermal implants for their art. Today, some of that has included people putting LED lights and magnets subdermally. As far as armor goes, according to bodyhackingcon.com, somebody actually tried this around 2016 utilizing D30, the same material put in motorcycle armor. These seemed to somewhat work, but were removed in the participant who tried it, and the other one who tried's body rejected it. I mean, realistically, normal body armor is a far better option, so I'm not sure how far we're gonna get on this one. Also, I get a little squeamish looking at this stuff, so for my part, I prefer the idea of prosthetics with armor. It may be quite some time before we're implanting cyber technology the way we've seen in Cyberpunk 2077. But oddly, it's not as far out of reach as it might seem and could just be an element of our future. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Real History Of. If you did, consider checking out last week's episode on Starfield and space exploration. And I'll see you next week.